Okay, it's 10 after. I'm going to start, and I'm enormously grateful to those of you who showed up on a rainy Friday, the week before Thanksgiving week, when you have so much work. I'm truly astounded. So I love you all. Thank you very much. Okay, and today's lecture is a kind of transition between this week's reading and next week's reading. And so those of you who are here will be well prepared for the reading for next week and, in fact, for the rest of the course. So the theme of winner-take-all politics was that if you really want to understand the enormous widening of inequality in America, you have to look not just at economic factors, changes in technology, changes in the global economy, you have to look at politics and power. So the theme was that that widening inequality is predominantly, the shape of inequality is predominantly due to issues about politics and power. So that leads to the question, how can we study politics and power? What are the most fruitful ways to study it? And how should we conceive of the way power works in the United States? That is, the theories I'm going to talk about are largely theories not about power in general in the world, but about power in the American context. So there are attempts to talk about power in politics more generally, but these theories are pretty much all about the American polity. And so as you hear about these theoretical approaches and these methodological approaches to power, I want you to think about the reading for this week, next week, and the last week of the course, because you will be able to apply these theories in different ways to the material that you've read. So there are many, many opportunities for thinking, wow, which of these theories would I apply to the case of widening inequality in America? Which would apply to the things we'll read next week? And then at the end, there's great reading. Don't slack off. The last week is really fun. So, all right. So I want to start with a very, very important problem, which is power, which is very important and which has been a preoccupation of both sociologists and political scientists. They do study it. They've tried to study it, but it is inherently very, very difficult to study. And there's such a fundamental problem that is really not resolvable, I think, or at least it's not resolved conceptually. If you go on to be a great social scientist, you could work on this, which is the normal basic understanding of power. This goes back to Max Weber, actually, is that power is exercised when essentially one person gets another person to do something that person would not do otherwise. So the way I've put it here is power is A's power over B, with the term over underlined. So it's when I make you do something, I make you spend 3 hours reading sociology that you would otherwise spend reading a novel, I believe. That is, I have exercised power over you by getting you to do something you don't want to do. But what if the thing I want you to do is something you do want to do? Or so then we're just cooperating. If I say, why don't we go to the movies? And you say, great, I'd love to go to the movies with you, then have I exercised power over you or not? And then what if when we go to the movies, I am so devoted to you that when you say, ooh, I'd love to see that new science fiction movie, even though I actually know I don't like science fiction all that much, I'm so eager to make you happy that I say, great, science fiction is great. Is that an exercise of power? So there are some times when you can observe A exercising power over B. You can really see someone making someone do something that person otherwise would not want to do. But in fact, a great deal of the most interesting work about power is about when the exercise of power is largely invisible. And when I talk about these theories and the methods related to them, you'll see that one of the biggest underlying questions is, where is power actually happening? Is it happening where you can see it, when the Senate and the House vote on legislation and it either wins or loses and the president either signs it or doesn't sign it? Is that where power is being exercised? Or is power being exercised before that in the back rooms where the legislation is being hammered out and they negotiate the details of the tax plan that's being negotiated, hopefully, right now? Or is it exercised way before that, when the various interests involved try to frame the issue so that people believe either that raising tax rates on the rich would be terrible for the economy and would lead to a slowdown in economic growth, or that raising taxes on the rich is actually good for the economy, and that the American economy has grown more when it had a more equalizing, I should say, a more progressive tax system? Or is it exercised way before that, when some groups in the society start out with more resources they can use to influence the political system, more money, more organization, more ideas, more sort of ideology? So understanding where power is actually happening is very, very difficult. And in fact, some people have moved away from studying the actual exercise of power at all and tried to say, look, we can solve the problem of power by basically ignoring how decisions are made, who participates, all these things I'm going to talk about in a minute, and let's just look at whether people's real interests are being served. So if you observe that the American people aren't getting what they need, and I don't know what you think, the capitalist class or global economic interests or traditional elites, I mean, some group is getting the things that are good for them, then maybe you've seen power happening even if you can't see it. But then, of course, you would need a good theory of what people need, apart from what they think they need. And unless you're quite sure that you know better than people themselves do what they really should want, then you don't know whether that's a good way to study power or not. So I'm not telling you that there are a bunch of bad ways and somehow the smarties have figured out the right way. I'm saying that this is a truly difficult problem. And then there's one additional problem, and this one I would like to cure you of, which is that when most Americans, and this includes American political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, and historians, go to study power, we are so deeply imbued with a profound belief in democratic values and in the equality of everyone and in one person, one vote, that at some level, that is our baseline model. We want to criticize power because it's not equally distributed. And so a great deal of the research has actually been designed to show you shock, surprise, horror, astounding revelation that power is very unequal. And I will just say that is not an analytically interesting issue. It's very important from a sort of moral point of view, from a public policy point of view, from a, go out there and fight for what you believe in point of view. But in fact, you cannot analyze how power works as long as you basically think power is bad, right? And that's, I don't mean you have to think power is good, love it, embrace it, want everybody to be, government to be more powerful. But you have to have an analytic interest. You have to be able to say, how do we explain what produces different outcomes. Not what ought to produce them, what does produce them. How can we explain how some people manage to accumulate power and why some people in some groups can use it more effectively than others? That is, the analytic task is impaired if all you're interested in is showing that things aren't as equal as they ought to be in a democratic society. Okay? So I'm going to try to get you not to change your democratic values, I hope not, but to think more analytically, more causally, more creatively about power and how it works. Now, in this class, we're not examining this question, but I will give you an example of this. Many dictatorships all over the world, but the ones that you would know more about are the well-publicized cases of dictatorships in Latin America, in Chile, in Argentina, and so forth, that murdered many of their own citizens. So they kidnapped and disappeared students, political activists, labor leaders, and so forth, and did this over a decade or two. Mostly this has stopped now, but it was a very serious problem, a little bit in Brazil. And you could ask, how effective was killing students and labor leaders in creating political stability? Right? That is a perfectly good explanatory causal question. And it doesn't mean you like it. It doesn't mean you believe in it. You're not recommending it. But there actually is a question about what the consequences of this are. If A happens, then what happens later? And most social scientists can't bring themselves to ask that question. So they're not really interested in how power was exercised. They're interested in, and it's very, very hard. So I'm not trying to turn you into amoral scientists who just, do experiments on people to torture them and so forth. Not that. But you've got to be interested in how things actually work causally. Why do regimes end up using that as a tactic? When do those tactics work? And what is the long-term outcome? What's the short-term outcome? So that's just one example of how there's a difference between the analytic sort of explanatory approach to power and our profound ethical approach, which we have to kind of hold in suspension, partly so that we can come back to it with renewed understanding. Okay, now that is the preliminary. I'm going to go through 4 approaches to the study of power, 3 of which are discussed in the reading for next week. So the first 3 are power elite theory, pluralist theory, and Marxist slash class theory. And I'm hoping to get through those 3 today and then go on to one that isn't discussed directly in the, you'll see it's the Whit is the author reading for next week. The 2 readings for next week are very short, and you'll find them, I think, very useful. Okay, so I'm going to go eventually through 4 approaches to the study of power, and for each approach, I'm going to talk about the relationship between its theory of what's going on and the methods it uses. Because in the study of power, as in the study of class and many other things, the methods you use in a profound way shape how you can argue, and new methods produce very new understandings. So you always are sort of going back and forth between theory and methods, theory and methods, theory and methods, and you can see that really clearly in the study of power. So power elite theories started out as based in American democratic values, finding 2 people's, I don't know if they really were shocked and horrified, but they wanted their readers to be shocked and horrified, that power was dominated by a small, cohesive elite that sort of ran things in their own interest. And these were typically studies of American small towns or medium-sized cities. So the classic study, this one called Community Power Structure, was a study of Atlanta, Georgia, when Atlanta was a much, much smaller and city than it is now. So this was in the 1950s, dominated by a white elite. And what Hunter, this original sort of power elite theorist, did, and what all power elite theorists typically do, they have to get a collection of names. So the question they're asking is a who question. Who has power? And what they need to do is get some method that gives them a list of the who they're trying to study. Who are the power holders? So the method Hunter used, which now seems kind of antiquated, but he went around and asked people. So he asked the newspaper editor, who are the powerful people in town? He asked, judges, who are the powerful people in town? He did it systematically, actually. So they asked, I think, 40 influential people who knew stuff about Atlanta, who are the powerful people in town? They got those lists of names, and they pooled the names, and then the people who were mentioned by many people became the central people they looked at. That was the power holders. And then once they had that list of names, they asked, who are these people? Well, it turned out, of course, most of them were wealthy. Not only that, most of them lived in the same neighborhoods. Their children went to school together in private schools. They belonged to the same clubs. They socialized together. And so even if one was the mayor and one was the owner of the local bank and the other was the local industry leader, and maybe even one was the local labor union leader, they actually sort of socially were part of the same group. So Hunter said, see, this power elite is basically running things behind the scenes, and yes, they come from different institutional spheres, right? So some are in business, some are in law, some are in politics, but they basically are the same kind of people. They all know each other and they all hang out together. Now, I just want to say, even if you didn't use that reputational method, so some contemporary people, there's a guy named Mark Mizruchi, M-I-Z-R-U-C-H-I, very good sociologist, who studies power elites now. He gets his list of names from corporate boards of directors, right? And he studies how interlocked those people are. First of all, how interlocked are they in the sense that they serve on this board of that corporation, that board of that corporation, and that links the two corporations together via sharing the same personnel on their boards. But also, how does that whole group of people, who are they? Who are these people who serve on the boards? And Condoleezza Rice serves on these boards, and big bankers serve on the boards, and so forth. So you can sort of get a picture of the structure of American capitalism by finding out who is on these boards, who are they, and how are they connected. So power elite theory doesn't have to use Hunter's what's called reputational method. It can use other methods, but what it looks for is the who. Who are the people who are the power holders? And then it asks, how are they interconnected? What are they like socially? Now, the problem with this, and this is particularly acute in the Hunter case, but it is often a problem with power elite theories, is that you generate this list of names, but you have not actually shown that any of these people exercise power. So there was a devastating critique of Hunter's book done by Nelson Polsby, who was one of the great political scientists at Berkeley, showing that in Hunter's entire book on the community power structure of Atlanta, he basically described no actual people exercising any actual power. He described their country clubs, he described their schools, he described the debutante parties their children went to and who married whom, but he never actually showed anybody exercising power. So let me just say, in sociology and political science, to a considerable extent, power elite theory was sort of dismissed on these grounds. That you didn't really show that these people, whose names you gathered by whatever method, were actually doing anything, and that's true for corporate boards of directors as well. One very strong, I think, suggestion that actually comes out of the recent financial crisis is that boards of directors don't do much of anything. They should. They should take responsibility. They should worry when the corporation they're on the board of. But they're part-time. They go to one meeting every 3 months. They get paid $100,000 or something a year for sitting on the board. They kind of provide, legitimation. You'll see when you get older that I do this. I mean, I'm on the board of, various little volunteer organizations. It's a little like being the faculty advisor to a decal, which is that you give your name to it, but you don't actually do much. So finding out whether these people in the, quote, power elite actually have any power is a real problem. So again, when I say focus personnel, what I really mean by that is the list of names. Who is supposed to be the power holder? The method could be reputational. That is, somebody says you're a member of the power elite or you're a member of the elite in your town, and you hang out with those people. That means you're one of the powerful. And so the critique is, do these people actually exercise power or not? So the theory that basically replaced power elite theory and drove it from the field, I would say, is called pluralist theory. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. But I want to say one other thing, which is maybe, and if you read this week's book carefully, we should be rehabilitating power elite theory. That is, whether or not it's true might differ in different historical eras. So maybe in the 1950s, the pluralist model described American politics really well. Maybe in the 20-teens, where we are now, some aspects of power elite theory are more plausible again. And this is actually something we need to think about. So I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying that the social sciences kind of largely dismissed this approach. Not completely. There's this guy named Bill Domhoff, who I don't know if he might have retired, but maybe not, teaches at Santa Cruz. And the funny thing about him, he's written book after book after book. And if you want kind of gossip about the power elite in America, read his stuff. It's amazing. And he's kind of a fanatic, whatever. But he is actually a psychologist by training. He's not a political scientist. And so he went at this just full bore and studies the Bohemian Grove, which is he's got a book on this called The Bohemian Grove, which is about, there's a club physically in California somewhere I think it's up in Mendocino somewhere, where powerful people from all over America, top generals in the military, top business people, top politicians. I knew someone years and years ago whose husband was the dean of Grace Cathedral, so the top Episcopal priest in San Francisco, just under the bishop. So the bishop was above him. And he got invited to the Bohemian Grove, where men, historically was all men, hung out for a weekend and got to know each other and schmoozed and performed in musicals where they dressed up like women. So, if you were interested in what the rich and famous do, not celebrities, but people who are in sort of the big institutional positions of power in the society, Bill Domhoff will tell you. So, all right, pluralist theory. The big innovation that led to the real development of pluralist theory, which has dominated political science, I would say it is still the reigning model. Now, sociologists don't talk about it very much because they're embarrassed to admit they believe in it, because if you're a good lefty, you kind of are skeptical about such things. You'll see why. But in fact, nothing very effective has really replaced it. So you need to take it seriously, and you'll see that the second article you're reading this coming week by Fred Block, in a way, is a Marxist take on pluralist theory. So sort of combines them. So what did the pluralists do that followed up on this critique of power elite theory. They said, let's study power by studying actual decisions. Let's not start with a list of people whom we assume are powerful. Let's start with a set of political conflicts and see who are the actors who had some influence on the outcome and who won. And this is, in fact, it's very time-consuming to do. That is, you actually have to, so let's imagine we were going to do a pluralist analysis of power at the national level in America today. You would have to pick a set of, I don't know what, 10 crucial issues. Maybe tax policy and healthcare. I'm trying to think of some things that sound more neutral. Housing policy, clean air and water, that is environmental policy, maybe even some less visible things like trade policy, international trade policy. Well, you'd try to think, if I sat down for 5 minutes, I could think of 10 things. And you would argue that those represented the really important issues. And then you would ask, where are those decisions being made? And some of them might be being made in Congress. Others may be, like, let's say, you were looking at antitrust policy that regulates the economy, that tells Microsoft they can't dominate, they can't freeze Google out of their, what's that called? Internet search system or something like that, or that when Apple and Samsung fight it out. That's antitrust policy. So you could have, and you could say some of this is being fought out in the courts, some is actually being fought out in Congress, some is probably being fought out in administrative agencies, and you would look at all the groups involved, the lobbyists, the politicians, the regulators, the people, submitting reports, the lawyers, and the, the Environmental Defense Fund that sends lawyers to insist on the Clean Air Act and so forth. And you would ask, who is actually exercising power here and who tends to win? So you would keep track of all the decisions. You would look at who the actors were that pushed this way and that way. And then you would analyze who had more power, right? And that is basically what Robert Dahl did in the 1950s. He studied it in a town rather than, that is a city, rather than in the nation. And he studied decisions in New Haven, Connecticut. He was at Yale, so that was why he studied New Haven. And he looked at decisions in a couple of, 4 different areas. So decisions about who would run for political office, decisions about where a new school would be built, decisions about how some urban renewal type project that was going to reshape the downtown would be handled, and so forth. And what he found was that, in his terms, there really wasn't a power elite. If you generated the names of who had power by looking at actual decisions, so you start from the decisions and you get your list of people from that, the people who have power are different in different spheres. So the basic insight of pluralism, and the word pluralism means plural groups, lots of different groups have power. So instead of it being one unified group who are all the same, different groups have power in different areas. So when it comes to decisions about school policy, the teachers' union plays a big role. The PTA plays a big role, and maybe real estate interests that want to be sure that the school won't be too close to their businesses play a role. Some, I don't know, merchants association or something. And when it comes to whether there'll be urban renewal in downtown, then big real estate interests, banks, the groups that are actually going to finance the project, government agencies that control zoning regulations and things like that, they play a big role. And when it comes to some other issue, very different groups play a role. So if I had to summarize the pluralist finding in one sentence, it would be different groups and individuals have power in different arenas. Now, the pluralists, there are different varieties because it was a very, very successful model and grew in political science. There are a lot of different versions of it. So in a way, the more successful any theory is, the more people elaborate it in different directions. So many pluralists said, look, we're not claiming that means that power is equal. We never said that. Of course, the groups who are important in one area versus another might all be what we would call elites. That is, even the active PTA members and the teachers union, these are middle-class people. And you know, occasionally for, let's say, and these pluralists have actually studied situations like this. There's going to be a big project in downtown, not Dahl, but this guy, Edward Banfield, who has a very bad reputation. If you ever know the name, you probably know him as a bad guy who said, oh, we should let the urban ghettos die. That was basically his view. But he wrote a really good book as a younger political scientist about Chicago. So any of you who are from Chicago, it's just a great book. And yeah, you'll learn more about how power works in that book than from virtually any other books. This book, Political Influence, is wonderful. It's a set of 8 case studies of very, very complex political decisions. But he showed, for example, that when Chicago was going to do a big urban renewal project, they were going to build a new courthouse, and that meant that all the lawyers would move their offices to where the new courthouse was going to be so they could be nearby. So huge real estate interests were involved, and they were going to build some housing, and they were going to build this new courthouse, and so the judges had to be on board. If the judges weren't on board, it wasn't going to happen. If the zoning board wasn't on board, it wasn't going to happen. So Chicago had a famous political machine, and the Chicago politicians kind of twisted the arms of the zoning board to make sure this thing would go through. And then real estate interests were involved because they were going to build the office buildings and rent them to the lawyers, and they were going to build the housing and rent the housing. And then, and this is a very important part of the pluralist model, so what you have is, that would fit the power elite image pretty well. You've got these, you know, judges, you've got big law firms, you've got big real estate interests, you've got big banks, and a few local, again, politicians who do things like zoning, and they all basically are going to decide how this is going to go. Well, they get into a conflict about this. You know, some neighborhood group opposes this, and they think it's going to disrupt their neighborhood, and they make a big stink in the newspapers. And some of the real estate interests have different interests than the others, so, and some of the law firms don't want to move, and others do. And once there's a conflict, suddenly people start turning to the public and trying to mobilize support for their view of how this, so if there had been no conflict, this would have all been a done deal, and really the general public would have had no role. But in fact, these elites are not completely unified. They do disagree about what they want. There are often conflicts, and at that point, the mayor starts making speeches where he says, it turns out the plans for these apartment buildings were all apartments that basically were for young single people or married couples who were high-powered professionals. These are, if you go to downtown San Francisco, I haven't actually done this, but if you look to buy a condo, friends of mine have told me these condos have kitchens that are about, 2 feet by 2 feet, but closets and dressing rooms that are gigantic. So they have these huge bathrooms with these enormous mirrors and these enormous closets. Why? Because the young professionals who are going to live there aren't going to cook. At most, they're going to bring home takeout, but they are going to be dressed to the nines every single day so they can go, they have to put on the power suit for the power meeting, for the power this. Well, that was more or less, this was a decade or many decades before, but it was similar. They were going to build housing for those people. Once there was this political conflict, Mayor Daley, who's the father of the Mayor Daley you may know of from contemporary Chicago politics, started saying, wait a minute, what about big families? And I would just tell you he's also Catholic, so this would have made sense for him and his constituents. What about big families? What about people with 3 and 4 and 5 children? We've got to have apartments for all the people. We've got to have low income and middle income housing. We've got to have 2 and 3 and 4 bedroom apartments. We can't just have apartments for these young professionals. We've got to start having housing that serves. So, whoa. So the pluralists emphasize both that different groups are involved in different kinds of decisions. They typically acknowledge that most of those groups are dominated by elites. But even though they're dominated by elites, they argue that often there's enough conflict one way or the other that those elites have to mobilize some support from a broader public to get their way. That is, you want to build that thing, by the end, you've got to include some middle income and low income housing or the thing is not going to happen. So there's compromise. That's another part of their model. Nobody gets everything he or she wants. It's always compromise. Hello? Yeah. I was looking at you, just trying to get people's attention. Okay, so they're very important compromise, and then one additional element of the pluralist way they imagine the world, which is, so different groups matter in different arenas. Why? Because different people and different groups care about different things. And the underlying principle, there's this paper by Norton Long called Local Politics as an Ecology of Games. It's a kind of cumbersome title, but the summary of his position is, it's a matter of, quote, whose ox is gored. Meaning, if your issue is the important issue, you can almost always find a way to have some influence. So most people don't have power over most issues because most people don't care about most issues very much. So if you look, for example, at abortion politics in the US, the group that has in the past, actually up until this election, been the most mobilized around abortion issues are the pro-life coalition. They really, 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 really care. So even if their point of view represents less than a majority of the population, and it turns out actually abortion attitudes have drifted up and down, but there's a pretty strong majority for abortion in at least some, I think vast majorities for save the life of the mother and so on and so forth. But how easy it should be to get an abortion, there's a lot of that attitudes on that drift around. But there's one group that has incredibly passionate, they care tons about it. So they have a disproportionate influence because they really, really, really care. And they're willing to trade off all the other issues in order to get what they want on that issue, right? And so the coalition around schooling has been able to have a huge influence on California politics because there is a group of actors, including teachers' unions, who really care about schooling for children. And so they actually are very important players there. And here's where pluralist theory even speaks to social movement theory. I'm not going to talk about social movements much until you'll see the last week's readings have to do with that. But the idea is that even a group that has basically no power is excluded from politics, as African Americans largely were before World War II, when most, not all, but most of the black population lived in the South, and that population had been completely disenfranchised by Jim Crow. So you have a big, big population who really aren't participating in pluralist politics, but the pluralists say at some point that group can organize, as it in fact did, and mobilize, and demand to start becoming a player in the political system. And at the point where people organize and fight, and then they may have to fight outside the political institutions because the political institutions have frozen them out, they also can have an influence, right? So the idea here is if different groups participate in different political arenas, and you start with the political arenas and then you look at who has power, you don't find a unified power elite, you find elites, but lots of different players. And even some of the groups, like teachers' unions, say, aren't necessarily so elite. Again, they're not usually the very poor. That, I think no pluralist would argue that this means we have political equality. They really don't. But they have a model in which lots and lots of groups can influence the political process if their issue, the thing that really matters to them, becomes an issue. So that's the argument. Pet owners. Now there's, most people aren't totally fanatical about leash laws. There are different sides. Some people are afraid of dogs. They don't want to get bitten by somebody on some trail somewhere. They don't want to have to deal with dog dew on their shoes. But pet owners really, really care about having places where their pets can run free and be off the leash and stuff. You will find local pet owner associations who actually manage to get changes in the local regulations, or another example, very important, San Francisco bicycle riders. To the degree they organize as a coalition and they have their Fridays when they ride bikes, mass, whatever it's called, and they sort of force BART to allow bikes on all day long and so forth. So you can see how groups mobilize around the thing that really matters to them, and that's the pluralist idea. Now, what's the critique of pluralism? And it's a very, very serious one. Well, there are several, but the major critique is that, well, first of all, that in fact these groups are so unequal. Yeah, you can influence the regulations about bike riding in San Francisco, and the powerful capitalists can influence the entire tax code, the entire way the financial system is regulated, the entire way industry is regulated, and you can't do squat about these big issues. So yeah, you can influence the tiny issues and they can influence the really, really big ones. So one critique is that this is sort of an image that makes things sound a lot more equal. Like you can do the thing you want and they do the thing they want. And the thing you really care about is bicycles and maybe a stop sign on your corner. And the thing they really care about is the entire nature of American capitalism and the proportion of the gains of capitalism that will go to them versus to everyone else. That'd be one critique. But the sort of more, sophisticated methodological critique is, if you focus on decisions, you can only study the issues that actually get decided. And the ones that never come up, the pluralist has no way of talking about them. And in fact, some of the most sophisticated work in this area is the attempt to define and study non-decisions. So how do things that could become political issues get pushed so far off the table that either they can't even be imagined, like, let's have a socialist economy in which everyone gets an absolutely equal share of the proceeds of the collective labor of everyone. That's not even debatable. So, and I'm not advocating this, but if you did advocate it, you'd just be, and there probably are some little socialist groups somewhere who do advocate it, you'd just be laughed off the, there's no way, there's nobody who imagines that as a realistic possibility in America. So there's no decision being made. And there are many, many non-decisions, like decisions, say, to regulate environmental dangers that we don't even know about or that no group is pushed. So there are a lot of groups pushing a lot of issues. And if you really did this right, you might have an incredibly wide range of, quote, decisions to look at. But the point of the critiques of the pluralist theory are that a lot of those issues never even come up for debate. And so when you focus on decisions, you focus only on the things that had enough power behind them to come up, and that a lot of power has actually been exercised prior to that in defining the range of legitimate debate. So the way in American society today, if you even start talking about making the society more equal, you're accused of class warfare and socialism. That is a way of making certain things off the table. You can't even discuss them. And that's what the critics of pluralism worry about. Okay, I'm going to go to the next argument. Oh, here, let me just say, I've had this slide in several lectures. I've wanted to show it. I'm going to show it here, because one thing the pluralists focus on, believe it or not, is voting. So one of the really important ways people exercise influence, according to the pluralist model, is not in back rooms where everything's being decided by a secret cabal. There may even be back rooms and secret cabals that would like to have their way. But in order to get their way, they pretty much have to find some group of voters who will elect somebody who will eventually make the decision the way these power holders want. And they may, as your book this week shows, use money to get that. But they have to translate their money somehow or other into votes for the things they want. So this slide, which actually was shown by Rachel Maddow about 5 years ago on MSNBC, but it comes from very good political scientist Larry Bartels. And this is one of the weirder slides ever, which is it shows income growth rates during Democratic and Republican administrations. This is why I could not give these lectures before the election. I would have been, I would have felt very awkward about it, even though I think it's very relevant. And my point here, I wrote this, elections matter. They really matter. I think I wrote that. And what Bartels is showing is income growth rates. So this doesn't include the 2008 collapse, and it doesn't include the bubble right before the collapse. But if you look from right after World War II to 2005, and you look at income growth rates for the different sectors of the economy, you see that income growth rates are much bigger at the bottom when the Democrats hold office than when the Republicans hold office. They are much bigger for the whole bottom 40, so this is the bottom 20th percent. This is the bottom 40th percent, so it includes this and everybody who's 40% of the income distribution and below do much better under Democratic administrations. Everybody from the 60th percentile, the next bar, and again, these are small numbers, so I don't know if you can see this, 2.6%, 2.5. These are, the scale is versus 0.4%. Those are the differences at the bottom here. But nonetheless, for the bottom 80th percent is the next to top bar. People still do better. Income growth is higher, has been historically over quite a long period of American history. Income growth has actually been higher for the bottom 80% of the population during Democratic administrations, substantially higher. And even for the top fifth, so this is the 95th percentile and below. And above. So this is I guess each of these is just the bottom 20th, the next 20th, next 20th, next 20th, and then the top 5%. And even for the top 5%, they do slightly better under Democratic administrations. That is wild. That is wild. And I think one thing is that, of course, this is what your book this week would say. Yeah, but if you look at the top 1%, they probably do much better under Republican administrations. And if you look at the top 10th of a percent, much, much better. and they have disproportionate influence. So the elections matter, but not everybody has an equal influence in elections. Okay, and I will do the Marxist class theory when I see you on Monday. And thanks for coming to class. Okay.